Michael Adler was the kind of man who made the world quieter, just by being in it. Not silent, quieter. He had a voice that settled rooms the way a hand settles a tablecloth, smoothing out the wrinkles, making everything even. He taught 7th grade history at Lincoln Middle School in Bethesda, Maryland, and he did it with the kind of patient, steady enthusiasm that made 12-year-olds actually care about the Constitutional Convention, which was a miracle by any measure. He wore khaki pants and button-down shirts that he ironed himself every Sunday night, because he believed that how you presented yourself to the world was a form of respect, both for the world and for yourself. He had brown hair that was going gray at the temples and a smile that arrived slowly, building from the corners of his mouth before reaching his eyes, like a sunrise that took its time because it knew the light was worth waiting for. He married Nadia 8 years ago. He married her at a courthouse in Arlington, because neither of them wanted a big wedding, and because Nadia said she didn't need a ceremony to know what she felt, and Michael said he didn't need an audience to make a promise. The judge who married them said they were the calmest couple she had ever seen, and Michael laughed and said calm was their specialty, and Nadia smiled and said nothing, because the truth behind that statement was something only she understood. Michael didn't know what his wife had been. He knew what she was now. She was a translator. She worked from home, freelance, translating technical documents from Russian and Arabic into English for government contractors and consulting firms. She sat at a desk in their spare bedroom with a cup of black tea and a pair of reading glasses, and she translated procurement reports and engineering specifications, and sometimes, on long afternoons, she translated old Russian poetry for her own pleasure because she said the language was more honest when it was being beautiful. She was 41. She had dark hair that she wore pulled back, and gray eyes that Michael called silver when he was being romantic, which was often because Michael Adler was a man who noticed things and said them out loud and didn't feel embarrassed about it. She was lean and precise in her movements, the way dancers are precise, every gesture deliberate, every step placed. She had a scar on her right shoulder that she said was from a car accident in her 20s. She had another scar on her left side, below the ribs, that she said was from the same accident. Michael never questioned the story because he trusted his wife, and because trust was the foundation of their marriage, and he was not the kind of man who went looking for cracks in foundations. Their life was small and good. They lived in a brick colonial on a tree-lined street. They had a garden that Michael tended on weekends, growing tomatoes and herbs that Nadia used for cooking. They had a 10-year-old golden retriever named Chester, who was too old for long walks but too stubborn to admit it. They had dinner together every night at the kitchen table. They talked about Michael's students and Nadia's translations and the book they were reading together, which they passed back and forth and discussed over tea in the evenings, one chapter at a time, because they were in no rush. They had nowhere to be except with each other. Michael Adler loved his wife with the uncomplicated, total devotion of a man who had found the person he was supposed to find and intended to spend every remaining day of his life proving he deserved her. He didn't know that the woman who sat across from him at dinner and laughed at his jokes and corrected his terrible Russian pronunciation and fell asleep with her head on his shoulder during movies had been, in another life, one of the most dangerous people the United States government had ever produced. And he didn't know that the government had tried to bury her, twice. The evening it happened was a Thursday in November. They were walking Chester around the block after dinner, the way they did every night, a slow loop through the neighborhood that took 20 minutes, because Chester stopped to smell everything and Michael stopped to talk to every neighbor, and Nadia walked beside them both with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes doing what they always did, scanning, cataloging, processing the environment in ways that were so automatic, she barely noticed she was doing it anymore. They were on Elm Street, 2 blocks from home, when the car pulled up. A black sedan, no front plate, tinted windows. It stopped at the curb 10 feet ahead of them and 2 men got out. They moved with purpose. One was tall and heavy, wearing a dark jacket. The other was shorter, compact, wearing a hat pulled low. The tall one had something in his hand. Michael saw them and his brain, his kind, trusting civilian brain, processed them as strangers who needed directions or whose car had broken down, or who were looking for an address. He actually took a step toward them. He actually opened his mouth to say, "Can I help you?" The tall one raised the gun and shot Michael in the chest. The sound was enormous in the quiet suburban street. It broke the evening apart. Chester yelped and lunged backward. Michael looked down at his chest with an expression of pure confusion, the expression of a man who has never been shot and doesn't understand what the feeling is. And then his legs gave out, and he sat down on the sidewalk, and then he fell sideways, and his head hit the concrete with a sound that Nadia would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. Nadia dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands went to the wound. Center chest, left of the sternum. The blood was coming fast, soaking through his button-down shirt, the shirt he had ironed on Sunday, spreading dark and wet across the khaki. His eyes were open. He was looking at her. He was trying to speak. "Nadia," he said. His voice was a whisper, a wet whisper. Don't talk, stay with me, Michael, stay with me." The two men were back in the car. The engine revved. The sedan pulled away. They were gone in 8 seconds. 8 seconds between the shot and the disappearance. Practiced, efficient, professional. Nadia pressed her hands against the wound and felt the blood pulse between her fingers, and she looked at her husband's face. This man who ironed shirts and grew tomatoes and taught children about the Constitution, and loved her without conditions and without questions. And she felt two things simultaneously. The first was grief so vast it was geological, tectonic, a shifting of plates beneath the surface of everything she was. The second was something older, something that lived deeper, something that the grief sat on top of but could not crush. The switch. She had felt it before, twice, both times in places far from Bethesda, Maryland, both times in situations where the distance between survival and death was measured in seconds, and the only thing that bridged that distance was the thing inside her that was not Nadia Adler, not the translator, not the wife, but the other one, the one underneath, the one that the CIA had built and used and tried to destroy, and failed to destroy because you cannot destroy something that is woven into the structure of a person's nervous system. She felt it engage now, not with anger, not with revenge, with clarity, cold, absolute, operational clarity. A neighbor, a woman named Patricia, was running toward them with a phone in her hand calling 911. Nadia heard sirens in the distance. She kept pressure on the wound. She talked to Michael. She told him to stay. She told him she loved him. She told him to breathe. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. The paramedics took over. They loaded Michael onto a stretcher and into the ambulance, and Nadia rode with them, and she held Michael's hand, and she watched the paramedics work, and she assessed the wound with an expertise that she shouldn't have had, that a freelance translator had no reason to possess, and she knew with the clinical detachment that was both her greatest asset and her deepest curse, that the bullet had entered left of center, and that if it had missed the heart, it had not missed the lung, and that the next 60 minutes would determine everything. Michael survived surgery. The bullet missed his heart by 2 centimeters. It collapsed his left lung. It nicked the pericardium. The surgeon, a trauma specialist named Dr. Okonkwo, who had been doing this work for 20 years, told Nadia that her husband was alive because the bullet entered at an angle that was slightly off from where it needed to be to kill him. 2 centimeters, the width of a thumbnail. That was the margin between Nadia being a wife and Nadia being a widow. Michael was in the ICU, sedated, intubated, alive. The monitors beeped in the rhythm that meant his heart was beating and his blood was flowing, and the body that held the man she loved was still functioning. Nadia sat beside his bed for 2 hours. She held his hand. She watched his chest rise and fall with the ventilator. She memorized the sound of the monitors because as long as she could hear them, he was here. Then she stood up. She kissed his forehead. She whispered something in Russian that she had never said to anyone before. A phrase from an old poem that meant, "I will come back to you, but first I have to go into the dark." She walked out of the hospital. She drove home. She walked past Chester, who was lying by the front door waiting for Michael to come home. She walked past the kitchen table where dinner was still sitting, uneaten, growing cold. She walked into the spare bedroom where she did her translations. She moved the desk. Underneath it, flush with the hardwood floor, was a section that looked like every other section of flooring, unless you knew where to press and how to press it. She pressed. The section released. Beneath it was a steel box set into the floor joists. Inside the box was a Walther PPQ pistol with a threaded barrel, a suppressor, 4 magazines, a combat knife, a set of lockpicks, a passport in a name that was not Nadia Adler, a satellite phone, and a file folder containing 14 pages of handwritten notes, written in a personal cipher that only she could read, documenting the details of her operational career, her extraction, her first death, her resurrection, her second death, and the names of the people who had decided both times that she was too dangerous to exist. Nadia Ostrova had been born in Moscow. Recruited at 19 by the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, trained for 3 years, and deployed to Western Europe as a deep-cover operative. She was exceptional. Her superiors said she had a gift for invisibility. She could adopt identities the way other people adopted accents. Completely, seamlessly, becoming someone else so thoroughly that the original person seemed to disappear. At 23, during an operation in Berlin, she was approached by the CIA. They didn't recruit her. They offered her something more valuable than recruitment. They offered her the truth. They showed her evidence that the SVR operation she was supporting was not intelligence gathering, but preparation for the assassination of a European NATO official, whose death would destabilize an alliance that protected millions of people. They showed her the files. They showed her the names. They showed her what she was really working for. Nadia defected. The CIA took her in. They gave her a new identity. They debriefed her for 6 months. And then they did something unusual. They offered her a position, not as an analyst, not as a consultant, as an operative, a ground branch operative in the Special Activities Center, the same unit that conducted the most sensitive covert operations on behalf of the United States. They wanted her because she was the best they had ever seen at disappearing, at becoming someone else, at moving through hostile environments without leaving a trace. She served for 11 years, 11 years of operations across Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa. She infiltrated Russian intelligence networks from the inside, using her knowledge of SVR tradecraft to identify and neutralize threats to American national security. She operated in spaces that no other American operative could access because she thought like the enemy. She spoke like the enemy. She moved like the enemy. She was the CIA's deepest ghost, an operative who existed in the space between two worlds, belonging to neither, serving one. Her call sign was Revenant, not Ghost, not Shadow, Revenant, something that comes back from the dead, because Nadia Ostrova had died twice. Once when the SVR discovered her defection and issued a termination order that the CIA faked her death to avoid. Her first burial, a staged car accident in Prague, a death certificate filed with the Czech authorities, flowers on an empty grave. The second time was harder. After 11 years of service, the political landscape shifted. A new administration, new priorities, new fears about the liability of an operative whose background included Russian intelligence training. Nadia's existence became inconvenient, not because she had failed, because she had succeeded too well. She knew too much. She had been too deep. She was a living archive of operations that certain people wanted forgotten. They didn't try to kill her. They erased her. They closed her file, they burned her covers, they deleted her from every database. They gave her a final identity, Nadia Adler, translator, and they told her that if she ever contacted the agency again, if she ever surfaced, if she ever gave any indication that she was anything other than a freelance translator living in Bethesda, Maryland, they would not protect her from anyone, including the Russians who still had an active termination order with her original name on it. They buried her a second time, not in a grave, in a life, a small, quiet, ordinary life with a golden retriever and a garden and a husband who didn't know. 7 years of that life. 7 years of tea and translations and dinner at the kitchen table and a man who called her eyes silver and meant it. 7 years of being Nadia Adler and almost believing it was enough. And then someone shot Michael on a sidewalk on Elm Street, and the Revenant woke up. Nadia dialed the satellite phone, a number she had memorized and never called. The number of a man who had been her handler for the last 6 years of her career, a man named Collins who had argued against her erasure and lost, and who had told her, on the day they said goodbye, that if she ever needed help, he would find a way. "This is Revenant," she said. The silence lasted 7 seconds. She could hear Collins breathing. "Nadia, Jesus, do you know what happens if this call is traced? My husband was shot tonight. In front of me. On our street. 2 men. Black sedan. Professional hit. I need to know who sent them, and I need to know in the next 4 hours. Nadia, I can't. Michael is in the ICU with a bullet 2 centimeters from his heart. He is a 7th grade history teacher. He grows tomatoes. He has never harmed another person in his life. Someone tried to kill him, and I need to know who, and I need to know now. Collins was quiet for a long time. Then, I'll make calls. Secure channel. Give me 3 hours. The intelligence came in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Collins was efficient when he was motivated, and the sound of Nadia's voice had motivated him in a way that few things in his career had, because he knew what she was, and he knew what she was capable of, and he knew that if he didn't give her the information through controlled channels, she would get it through uncontrolled ones, and the result would be significantly worse. The hit on Michael was not random. It was connected to a man named Victor Laskin. Laskin was 54, former FSB, Russia's Federal Security Service. He had left government service 8 years ago and established himself as a private intelligence broker operating out of Vienna, buying and selling information, access, and occasionally violence. He maintained connections to Russian intelligence while operating independently, a status that gave him both protection and deniability. He was known in the intelligence community as someone who facilitated operations that the Russian state wanted done, but couldn't officially authorize. Laskin had recently acquired a piece of information, a name, a real name attached to an old SVR termination order. Nadia Ostrova, the Russian defector who had spent 11 years destroying Russian intelligence networks from the inside. The operative the SVR had been hunting for 20 years. The ghost who died twice and never stayed dead. Laskin had identified Nadia, not through the CIA, through a retired SVR officer who had kept personal records against regulations and who had sold those records to Laskin for 200,000 euros. The records included an old photograph, a surveillance image from Berlin, 2003. Nadia at 23. The face had aged, but facial recognition technology had improved, and Laskin had access to commercial databases that scanned driver's license photos and social media images, and the gap between a 23-year-old Russian operative and a 41-year-old American translator was not as wide as Nadia had hoped. Laskin didn't want Nadia dead himself. He wanted to sell her location to the SVR, but he wanted proof of identification first. Proof that the woman living in Bethesda was really Nadia Ostrova. So he sent 2 men to provoke a reaction, not to kill Michael, to wound him, to force Nadia out of her cover, to see what she would do when the person she loved was hurt in front of her. Because an ordinary translator would call the police and wait. A former covert operative would do something else entirely. The shooting was a test. Laskin was watching to see if the ghost would wake up. She woke up, and she was going to make sure he regretted it. Collins provided Laskin's current location. He was in Washington, D.C. He had arrived 3 days before the shooting and was staying at a hotel in Georgetown under a German passport. He had 2 men with him, security, former military. They were staying in adjacent rooms. Nadia memorized the information. She destroyed the satellite phone, not with a hammer, with a process she had learned during her agency years, removing the SIM, degaussing the memory, disassembling the components and distributing them across 6 different locations. Then she went to work. She surveilled the Georgetown Hotel for 24 hours. She identified Laskin's room. She identified the security details rooms. She mapped the hotel's layout, its camera positions, its staff schedules, its entry and exit points. She did this from across the street, from a coffee shop, from a park bench, from a ride-share car that circled the block at random intervals. She was invisible. She was what she had always been, a presence that left no impression. A face that no one remembered. The revenant operating in a city that was supposed to be safe, moving through it the way she had moved through cities in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, like smoke through a building. She entered the hotel at 2 a.m. through a service entrance accessed from the alley behind the building. The door required a key card. Nadia had obtained one by cloning the card of a housekeeping employee who had left it on a cart in the hallway during her surveillance shift. The cloning device was the size of a credit card. It took 4 seconds. She moved through the service corridor to the staff elevator. She took it to the 4th floor. She walked the hallway in soft-soled shoes that made no sound on the carpet. She passed Laskin's security details rooms. She could hear the television in one of them. The other was dark and silent. She picked the lock on Laskin's door in under a minute. The lock was electronic, but the override mechanism was mechanical, a feature of older hotel systems. And Nadia had been picking locks since she was 20 years old in an SVR training facility outside Moscow. The room was dark. Laskin was asleep. He slept on his back, one arm across his chest, the way certain military men sleep, ready to move, even in unconsciousness maintaining a posture of readiness. His phone was on the nightstand. A laptop was on the desk. A pistol was in the top drawer of the nightstand, which Nadia opened and removed and disassembled and placed in the bathroom sink before returning to the bedside. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She waited. Laskin woke at 2:23 a.m., not because of noise, because of presence, the same instinct that makes prey animals lift their heads when a predator enters the clearing. He opened his eyes and turned his head and saw a woman sitting in the chair beside his bed, her hands resting in her lap, her gray eyes watching him with an expression that contained no anger, no fear, nothing that he could use, just clarity. The terrible final clarity of someone who has already decided everything and is simply executing the last steps. "Viktor Laskin," Nadia said in Russian. Her Russian was flawless. It had always been flawless. It was the first language she had ever spoken, and it came out of her now like something that had been held underwater and was finally allowed to surface. "You sent 2 men to shoot my husband, a history teacher, a man who has never held a weapon in his life. You did this to test whether I would react, to confirm whether the woman living on Elm Street in Bethesda was Nadia Ostrova." Laskin stared at her. His hand moved toward the nightstand drawer. "Your pistol is disassembled in the bathroom sink," Nadia said. "Your security is in the rooms on either side of us. If you call for them, they will arrive in approximately 15 seconds. I need 4. So the question is whether you want to have a conversation or whether you want to discover what I can accomplish in 4 seconds. I will tell you honestly that you will not enjoy the second option." Laskin's hand stopped. "You found my name," Nadia continued. "You bought it from a retired SVR officer who kept records he shouldn't have kept. You ran facial recognition. You identified my location. You planned to sell my identity to Moscow for what, 2 million? 3? Is that what 20 years of hunting is worth? Is that what my husband's blood on a sidewalk is worth?" Laskin's face was still, calculating. He was an intelligence professional. He processed information the way professionals process information, looking for leverage, for advantage, for the gap he could exploit. "I have no quarrel with you personally," he said in Russian. His voice was measured, careful. "This is business. You understand business. You were SVR before you were CIA. You know how this works. Information has value. Your identity has value. I'm simply facilitating a transaction. You facilitated a bullet into my husband's chest. That was regrettable. The men were instructed to wound, not kill. A provocation. I needed to see if you would surface. You surfaced, which confirms your identity, which means the transaction can proceed." He paused. "Unless we can reach an arrangement." Nadia looked at him. She looked at this man who sat in hotel rooms in Georgetown and sold people's lives the way other men sold stocks, and who spoke about her husband's blood as a regrettable provocation, the way you might speak about a delayed shipment or a missed appointment. "Here is the arrangement," Nadia said. "I have spent the last 24 hours building a file on your operation. Your communications, your financial accounts, your client list, your travel patterns, the identity of the retired SVR officer who sold you my records. I cloned your phone this evening while it was sitting on the nightstand. Your laptop's hard drive was copied remotely through the hotel's Wi-Fi network using a device I planted in the business center yesterday morning. I now have everything, every operation you've brokered, every intelligence product you've sold, every government you've worked with and every government you've worked against." Laskin's face changed. The calculation shifted, the variables rearranged. "That file will be delivered simultaneously to the CIA, MI6, the BND, and the Mossad within the next 2 hours. Every intelligence service you've sold to will learn that you've also been selling to their adversaries. Every client will learn that you've been compromised. Your network will collapse. Your accounts will be frozen. Your aliases will be burned. You will be the most exposed intelligence broker in the Western world by sunrise." Nadia leaned forward, "And the SVR will receive a separate communication informing them that Viktor Laskin, their trusted independent contractor, has been selling Russian intelligence secrets to Western agencies for the past 8 years, which, based on the contents of your laptop, appears to be true. Moscow's termination order for Nadia Ostrova is 20 years old and may or may not still be active, but the termination order they'll issue for Viktor Laskin will be very new and very active and very motivated." The color left Laskin's face. It left slowly, like water draining from a basin, until what remained was gray and hollow and old. "You can't," he said. "If you expose me to the Russians, you exposed me first. You took my quiet life. You took my safety. You shot my husband to see what I would do." Nadia's voice dropped, not to a whisper, to something below a whisper, to the frequency at which words stop being communication and start being something closer to gravity. "I'll tell you what I do. I survive. I have survived the SVR, the CIA, 2 governments that wanted me dead, and 20 years of living under names that aren't mine. I survived because I am better at this than anyone who has ever tried to stop me. The CIA buried me twice and I am still here. You think you can test me? You think you can poke the ghost and watch what happens?" She stood up. "What happens is this. You disappear, not the way I disappeared, into a life, into a person. You disappear the other way, into nothing, into the space between agencies, into the world where no one protects you and everyone hunts you. That is what happens when you shoot a history teacher to prove a theory." She walked toward the door. "Your 2 men," she said without turning around. "They're already being identified through the ballistic evidence from my husband's shooting. The Bethesda police have the case. The FBI will have it by morning because a shooting in a suburban neighborhood near the capital, with characteristics consistent with a professional hit, will trigger federal interest. Your men will be found. They will be arrested. They will cooperate because men like them always cooperate when the alternative is 40 years federal, and they will lead the investigation directly to you." She opened the door. "You should leave the country tonight, Victor. Not because I'm telling you to, because by tomorrow morning there won't be a safe country left." Nadia walked out. She closed the door behind her. She walked down the hallway and through the service corridor and out the alley entrance and into the Washington night, and she disappeared the way she had always disappeared, completely, totally, like a stone dropped into deep water. No ripple, no trace, no evidence she had ever been there. The transmissions went out at 4 a.m. Every intelligence service on Nadia's list received the file simultaneously. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Laskin's network, built over 8 years of careful brokering, collapsed in a matter of hours. Accounts were frozen in 4 countries. 3 of his clients issued burn notices. 2 others initiated their own investigations into the extent of their exposure. The SVR received their communication at 5 a.m. Moscow time. By noon, a termination order was issued for Viktor Laskin, priority level that indicated the matter was considered urgent and personal. Laskin fled the Georgetown Hotel at 3:30 a.m., 45 minutes before the transmissions. He made it to Dulles Airport. He boarded a flight to Zurich using the German passport. He landed in Zurich and attempted to access his primary account. Frozen. He attempted his secondary account. Frozen. He attempted to contact his network. No response. He stood in the arrivals terminal of Zurich Airport with a carry-on bag and a passport that would be flagged in every database within 24 hours, and he understood, with the complete and crushing finality of a man who has made the worst miscalculation of his career, that he was finished. He was arrested by Swiss authorities 6 days later at the request of Interpol. The charges included espionage, brokering of classified intelligence, and conspiracy. He was extradited to Germany, where additional charges were filed. His trial lasted 4 months. He was convicted on all counts. The sentence was 22 years. The SVR termination order remained active, which meant that even inside a German federal prison, Viktor Laskin would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. The 2 men who shot Michael were identified through ballistic evidence and surveillance footage from a neighboring house's doorbell camera. They were arrested in Baltimore 3 weeks after the shooting. Both cooperated. Both provided testimony connecting the operation to Laskin. Both received sentences of 20 years federal for attempted murder and conspiracy. The retired SVR officer who sold Nadia's records was identified through Laskin's files. His name was passed to the appropriate counterintelligence agencies. What happened to him after that was not something Nadia followed. Some threads you cut and walk away from. Collins called her 1 month later. Secure channel. Short conversation. The agency is aware of what you did. They're not happy, but they're not unhappy either. Laskin was a problem they hadn't solved. You solved it. I didn't do it for them. I know. How's Michael? He's home. He's healing. He's teaching again next semester. Does he know? Nadia was quiet for a long time. He knows some of it. I told him some of it. Not everything. Not the details. But enough to understand why it happened and who I was before I was his wife. How did he take it? Nadia thought about the conversation. She thought about sitting on the edge of their bed while Michael lay propped up on pillows with his surgical scar still pink and fresh, and she told him the version that she could tell, the version that was true without being complete, the version that said, I was an intelligence operative for a long time and I left that life and someone from that life found us, and that is why you were hurt. And I am so sorry, Michael. I am so sorry. And Michael had looked at her with those brown eyes, the eyes that built sunrises when they smiled. And he had taken her hand and he had said, Are we safe now? Yes. Then that's all I need to know. And she had cried. For the first time since the shooting. For the first time since she walked out of the hospital. For the first time since she sat in a chair beside Victor Laskin's bed and dismantled his world with her voice. She cried because Michael Adler, this man who taught 7th graders about the Constitution and grew tomatoes and ironed his shirts on Sunday night, had absorbed the revelation that his wife was a former intelligence operative who had been buried twice by the CIA with the same calm steadiness with which he absorbed everything else, and he had decided that loving her was more important than understanding every part of her. He took it like Michael takes everything, Nadia told Collins. Quietly. Completely. Collins was quiet for a moment. You're one of the most remarkable operatives I've ever worked with, Nadia. But I think the most remarkable thing you've ever done is build a life with someone who loves you without needing to know everything. Goodbye, Collins. Goodbye, Nadia, for the last time, I hope. For the last time. She destroyed the secure phone. She went downstairs. Michael was sitting at the kitchen table grading papers. Chester was lying at his feet. The garden was visible through the window, the tomato cages standing empty in the November cold, waiting for spring. Michael looked up. Tea? Please. He made tea. He made it the way she liked it. Black, no sugar, steeped for exactly 4 minutes. He set it in front of her and sat back down, and picked up his red grading pen and went back to correcting essays about the Bill of Rights. Nadia held the cup in both hands. She felt the warmth of it against her palms. She watched her husband grade papers. She listened to Chester breathe. She looked at the garden through the window and the empty street beyond it. The street where Michael's blood had been on the sidewalk 5 weeks ago. The street that was quiet now, that was safe now, that was just a street again. The Walther was back in the steel box under the floorboards. The file folder was beside it. The passports, the tools, the weapons, all of it sealed and stored. The Revenant was buried a 3rd time. This time by her own hand. This time she hoped for good. But hope is not certainty. And Nadia Ostrova, who had lived under more names than she could count, and died more times than any person should survive, understood that the world does not make promises. The world makes conditions, and the condition of her peace was her willingness to defend it. She drank her tea. She watched her husband work. Chester sighed in his sleep. The house was warm and quiet, and the only sounds were the scratch of Michael's pen, and the ticking of the kitchen clock, and the steady, reliable beating of 2 hearts that had come very close to being separated and had not been. Some people wear capes. Nadia wore reading glasses and drank black tea and translated Russian poetry in a spare bedroom in Bethesda, Maryland. And she was the most dangerous person in the city, and nobody knew it except a man in a German prison who would never stop looking over his shoulder, and a retired handler who had promised to forget her name, and a husband who loved her without needing to know everything. The Revenant, buried 3 times, still breathing, still here. If you believe that true heroes carry scars and not capes, share this story.